everyone, and welcome to the Dear Dyslexic podcast series. I'm your host, Shae. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. This podcast is proudly sponsored by a DDF community member. If you love our podcasts, then why not sponsor one today? Find out how at deardyslexic.com. Today, I'm thrilled to be speaking with Ben Fogarty. Ben is a barrister at the Denman Chambers with expertise across a number of areas of law, including discrimination law, specialising in disability discrimination. Ben was part of our 2021 Disability Conference, and his presentation was so well received, I wanted to have a follow-up conversation with him about his work and disability law. Ben has worked for a number of organisations, including the Intellectual Disability Rights Service, Darwin Community Legal Service, and the New South Wales Disability Discrimination Legal Centre. We hope you enjoy this podcast today. Thank you for coming on the show, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Shae. It's a pleasure to talk some more and share my knowledge about disability discrimination law, but other laws that may assist people with dyslexia.
Can you give us a little bit of background on where you've worked and how you've helped previously?
Sure. So just recently I clicked over 10 years as being a barrister in New South Wales. Prior to that, for 12 years I was a lawyer, I think. I've been sort of doing legal stuff for 22 odd years. The latter parts of that, probably 8 or 9 years, I worked in community legal centres, which I absolutely loved. The first one was Redfern Legal Centre in Sydney. The next one was New South Wales Disability Discrimination Legal Centre. Then I went to Darwin for a bit, to Darwin Community Legal Service, back to Sydney to Intellectual Disability Rights Service, now called Ability Rights Service, also in Sydney, obviously supporting and giving legal advice to people with cognitive disability. Then I did a stint at Homeless Persons Legal Service. That was my last solicitor job. And in between that, I did some work in one of the big law firms, and I'll probably come and talk a bit more about the big law firms in Sydney. In their pro bono section, I filled in for a partner there who was having maternity leave. So, yeah, I taught criminal law along the way as well at one of the unis in Sydney at UNSW, so I kept myself on my toes that way. I've done disability discrimination law probably since 2004 when I was a principal solicitor at Disability Discrim Legal Centre, and then I've continued to do it all along the way. And I've got a matter right now that, fingers crossed, is just about to settle for a young person with physical disabilities that's gone to the federal court, where, again, I might talk about that later, about where things can end up going to. So
how did you get, because working in law, there's so many different areas that you could be working in. What attracted you to working in this space?
Like my whole career, probably, I meandered around. So I left uni and got a summer clerkship, and which means, you go into these big law firms and they schmooze you, and it's never. Well, I knew it was never going to last forever because I wanted to do sort of soulful work with the greatest of respect to those places. So then I kind of left that realm after 4 or 5 years, and I had said to myself that I would always volunteer, and just never did that, and felt a bit bad about never having done it. So I had my teaching gig at uni part-time, and I was doing some tutoring as well. And so I went to Redfern Legal Centre. In fact, I went to a few and said, I'd like to volunteer. I'm a lawyer, but I've worked at the other end of town. Can I do something? And they took me on board, and they re-engineered my brain to be able to speak to people as opposed to corporations. And then the job came up across the road. It was literally across the road. They were looking for a principal solicitor at the Disability Discrimination Legal Centre, and I don't know, I just loved it. I loved and still do love helping individuals, and just the feeling that you're achieving a result for an individual, that particularly where if you're doing it pro bono or at a reduced rate, they wouldn't, or through legal aid, those persons wouldn't have access to a lawyer at all. So I don't know, I got a real buzz out of that. I always have. It's a stark difference to the corporations that I used to work for. Again, that's something some lawyers like to do, but I just felt like I was a bum on a seat, and if I wasn't there, someone else would be there. Whereas Redfern Legal Centre, I can still remember the matters. This was 2003 or 4. they still sit in my brain about people that I helped and how grateful they were. I was really moved by the genuine gratitude that humans would give me or people would give me that I hadn't found in my career so far. So it's continued, and I do work these days, employment work for respondents, but I like to think too that I bring a sort of fairness to that and understand both sides. And most of those matters, many matters, resolve and mediate; they don't run. So yeah.
Well, thank you, because I know there'll be a lot of people out there that not just that you've helped, but that you will continue to help, and it's such an important area. We get a number of calls through our 1-800 helpline, which is a peer support helpline, really. People coming to us that feel they may have been discriminated against. What we see come up frequently is people actually graduating and then not being able to pass the registration. And so trying to help them navigate to a certain point where then they need to decide, do they get legal support or who do they go to get that help? But we're not a legal service at all. That's not my background. So when people that have dyslexia, because I think one of the key challenges for workplaces is they don't have a really good understanding of or awareness of dyslexia, and that it is a disability under the Disability Act, and that people can be discriminated against if they don't access the reasonable adjustments or the supports that they require based on their disability.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the challenges in the workplace. But how do people go about seeking that support if they're struggling in the workplace or they feel that they've been discriminated against? And I mean, that's a huge question, and we don't have a lot of time. But maybe if you could give some thoughts around some starting blocks for people that may be feeling this is happening to them.
Yeah. Okay, a few things to think about, hoping not to teach people to suck eggs, but always try and resolve it with the employer. Obviously, if it's an employment context, try and do it informally. Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, or ADNSW, and the Australian Human Rights Commission, the two bodies that you take a complaint to in New South Wales at least, will always ask you, have you tried to resolve it informally? Most people have. That's what we try and do, don't we? Try and sort it out and not have to make it go any further. Both of those ports of call, and you can bring a Disability Discrimination Act for the disability of dyslexia in employment to either of those places. There's two separate acts that provide that right. So, and both of those avenues, both the ADNSW and the Australian Human Rights Commission, try to resolve matters without lawyers by way of conciliation. If one side wants to bring a lawyer and the other side, that is the complainant, the person doesn't have one, they'll make sure that it's a sort of fair playing field when it's a conciliation. So the starting point, I know people will say, I'm nervous, but those two organisations support people to bring matters to conciliation. They'll assist people when, they'll file a complaint. They'll say to them, is there anything else you want to add to it? They can't advise them, but they'll make sure that they have everything they need to go into a conciliation. Now, most conciliations resolve matters. Some don't, and when they don't, that's when you need to think about whether you go to court, and definitely at that point you'd want to talk to a lawyer. Some people might say along the way, I don't feel that I want some support going in there. That's fair enough. Advocacy groups, I know, depends on disability, it depends on where you are, and sometimes they're few and far between, but an advocate may assist a person just to be there to support them through the conciliation process. And I don't see why the Commission or the Anti-Discrimination Board wouldn't allow that, as long as that person, in the conciliation just sort of abided by the rules and just supported the person. If you're a union member, they might support you, although I've heard mixed reviews about unions, and, they don't often have the expertise, and their lawyer might have to do employment law and all different sorts of law, and may be reluctant to run into an area that they're not familiar with. So that may not always be a place you can rely on, unfortunately. There are a couple of legal centres, Australian Centre for Disability Law in Sydney. Again, very limited resources. They do discrim work, and they would be a place to go to.
Is that so nationally anyone could access their service?
Yeah. So that used to be New South Wales Disability Discrimination Legal Centre where I worked, but then they got some different funding, and they're now national, and they're not just discrimination. But I saw their annual report because I'm a member of theirs a couple of days ago, and it's still 80% of their work is discrim. There are also some other legal centres, and I've been out of the loop a bit for a while, but there are some in other states. So I know Victoria's got a couple of disability rights places, Villamanta, some others that specialise in disability. I want to say AED Legal down in Victoria do a lot of employment law for people with disabilities. So there are other places. If you Google NACLAC, I think it is NACLC, just community legal centres, Victoria, New South Wales, Australia, you'll find, and just work your way through that. You'll find the legal centres, but again, they're most of them have very limited resources and such a big market of people that need their help. Some of the big legal firms, so the place I worked at, a number of them will do discrimination work, but I suppose it's finding out who they are, how to contact them, and they have they have their parameters around who they support, but they do discrimination work. Probably you need Australian Centre of Disability Law or someone like me just to make that contact first and say I'll speak to them. But equally, if you go onto their websites, they're the bigger ones that run in most of the cities across Australia. You can look up, if you just Google pro bono and look up law firms, you'll start seeing some, and it's nothing to stop you to picking up the phone and giving me a ring. In fact, I recall I referred a client, a fellow with dyslexia, many years ago from the centre across to one of the law firms to help in a matter, now that I think about it, some time ago. So, yeah, there are those areas of support. Legal Aid New South Wales, I can't speak for Victoria and Queensland, but they're pretty similar, I think. They have a human rights section that will take on matters in limited budget. They'll take on matters where there's, real systemic change that could happen from it. So again, there might be someone with dyslexia in employment, or even with respect to a service where, you can see, wow, if this is happening in this office here and it's a national office, or in this shop here and it's a chain store across Australia, and the person can't get informal resolution, it might be one that Legal Aid says, this is a good one. This is one that we want to take on. So there are a range of different places. If a person has a claim that looks systemic, there are pro bono places. There's Legal Aid to talk to.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. The D Hub is our digital learning space where you can access our first Australian e-learning courses for those working and supporting dyslexic employees, as well as webisodes, online courses, communities of practice, and much, much more. So head to the D Hub today and start your learning journey. dhub.ddyslexic.com.
Places like yourself and different advocacy groups that know more can almost be the middle person between someone like me or those law firms and the person who just goes, I've no idea how I'd find a lawyer, and do I have to pay, and how much would it cost? Because, these matters aren't about $1 million matters, so there aren't private lawyers who are going to take these matters on. They're usually about, I'll say, the principle of the matter, and that's as important as anything in my view. So there's very few privates that one that I would trust know the law, and two that you'd send a person to, and they're going to spend thousands of dollars on a matter that really, the service or the employer shouldn't have done it in the first place. So, yeah, they're limited, but if you can get through to some of the people like myself or other the firms or Legal Aid or what have you, they'll be able to steer people in the right direction.
And so through your working career, have you had or seen many cases where someone with dyslexia has taken an employer or an organisation to court?
I remember one in particular, a big private school in Sydney where I acted for the parents, and forgive me, I know there's dyspraxia, there's dyslexia, there's a range of different disabilities that I don't know enough about, but I think this was more of this involved, and you might say this is an aspect of dyslexia, is the processing between this child looking on the board and writing down, and they needed supports around that. Their brain just really, not suggesting people with dyslexia aren't really bright. Of course, this kid was super bright, and he was in an excelling class, and this school is renowned for getting brilliant marks, so he could do a lot of amazing things, but there were certain things he couldn't do with respect to stuff written on the board, and the school just refused to do it. I think they thought, we don't want someone like this going through the HSC, la, 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 la. was also a political school, and there was a lot of pressure being put on by some powerful old boys. And I'm trying to remember what the result was, but we took it on for a while. And I think in the end, sadly, and this often happens in education matters, is that the blood is so bad and there's so much distrust between parent and school and principal that sadly the only outcome that's going to work for the sanity of the child and the parents is to go to a different school. I think that's what happened, but we gave them a red hot crack. So that was an education matter. I think that was when I was at the Disability Discrimination Legal Centre, or not long after. Another one was, and this, I'm pretty sure this is the fellow who I referred off to the firm, but I helped him for a while. This involved an MP's office asking and demanding that this person only contact that office by writing. I hope I don't give this away for someone who might be listening to this, but I'm de-identifying as best I can. But just a shocker. The MP obviously didn't like this, one of his constituents, because this constituent exercised his democratic right to be telling his MP certain things, and he'd come down or he'd ring, and this MP turned around knowing that my client had dyslexia and said, no, I'm not refusing you access to my office. What I'm telling you is you've got to put it in writing before you get here. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. I should have believed it. We then went and had a meeting with this MP. The client came with me. I've got to say, this is pretty wet behind the ears in those days. I'm a lot more robust now, but I've never felt more intimidated and bullied by this MP in this meeting. He gave us about 5 minutes before we had to go down to Parliament. Went to his office. It was amazing. And he said, I got to go now. The bells were going. He ran off down to Parliament. So those are the two that stick in my mind some time ago, not what great outcomes. And that one, I think in the end, he backed off because it was a lay down misère. There was no reason why. You know, if we'd run that through to, he was about to file in the Anti-Discrimination Board, as it then was, so under the State Act. But either way, there was no defence that MP could have run to defend that. It was just being, excuse my French, an a-hole, and didn't want this guy to be exercising his right. I mean, you're an MP, mate. Suck it up. This guy was a lobbyist and someone who was in your constituency. You needed to listen to him. I haven't had a lot of others than that. I remember one, and I can't remember whether it was a matter we took on or whether it was one that I read. It's so long ago. But in terms of and it gets down to this defence of inherent requirements, which some of the people that come to you might hear about, which is where you can't adjust, where you're asking for a reasonable adjustment that so affects or changes the role, i.e. it removes parts of the role that inherent requirements that the law says, well, the employer is entitled not to make that reasonable adjustment and they're not actually breaking the law. So there was a case about a fellow who needed to read, it was a warehouse case from memory, and it might have been a matter that came to us, and he couldn't, there were aspects of the reading of these of signs in this warehouse that he had trouble with. So long ago now, I can't remember. I think we did resolve it, and there might have been a really clever way with colour coding or numbering that he was fine with, that they could do it. And so I think we might have been able to get a resolution. But yeah, I haven't had one for a long time, not at the bar. So I'm not sure whether people are just, who knows? You probably know better than me as to why they just cop it, or, the classic, I don't know if I talked about it now. I can't remember what I said. I don't think I did in my talk for your conference, but, people that come to you would talk about the age-old problem with an invisible disability. When do I disclose that I have it? Do I do it at the interview? How do I do it? When do I do it? Why do I do it? And why is it relevant? And it's all well and good for me to pontificate and say, well, they can't do this and this, but are you ever going to be able to prove why you didn't get the job? Was because of your dyslexia, because you disclosed it.
And it's interesting you raise that, because through the research I'm doing, we've been interviewing people with dyslexia, and that's been one of the initial barriers, is where people have asked for reasonable adjustments in an interview, and they said, just give it your best shot, you'll be right, and they haven't got those jobs. And that's the thing, you can't say, well, it's because of my dyslexia, but it feels like it's because of their disability. And if they'd had those reasonable adjustments, then they probably would have been able to do a better job at the application. Doesn't mean they might have got the job, but at least they were able to work to the best of their ability. And I think we could probably have a whole nother podcast on reasonable adjustments and that conversation around when does it become not reasonable. But I won't take us down that rabbit warren today.
I mean, the most inane but accurate response to that is that each set of circumstances turns on its own facts. And that's just important for people to realise that just because Jack down the road got a job and their employer adjusted it doesn't necessarily mean that my employer is discriminating against me if they're not giving me that adjustment. It's quite subtle, and, because your employer might have a greater income, my role might be slightly different to Jack's. It's really, until you know all of the relevant circumstances of the situation, it's hard to kind of say to someone, oh, yeah, you should run your case because they don't have a leg to stand on with inherent requirements, or those adjustments they suggested, do fall short, and the ones you argue are reasonable and they should have made them. It's a tough one to answer off the cuff.
It's a difficult area, isn't it? But I wonder whether that's why people don't push forward and get the support or take it further. They just quit that job and say it's too hard. And I think in most cases it's probably people leave the job.
I think that's right. They leave the job and they don't have the energy to have a fight or knowledge that there's anything much they can do about it. And it may have become normalised for them. That may have been what's happened to them for most of their lives and careers. So, it's quite sad. And again, if you're running a discrim case against an employer, it's probably almost too late. The human interaction and the ability to continue to work with them, you're probably, if you haven't been able to informally resolve it with them, then you're probably not going to keep the job, or you're not going to want to. Sadly, always in the disability rights space, changing attitudes and making people empathetic, and that's what it is at the end of the day. Disability discrimination is about walk in my shoes or push yourself in my chair for a day, and I think pretty quickly you'd resolve the complaint. It's really about understanding, and that you can't change. You can't change ignorance overnight. You can't change stereotypes. We see it everywhere in all sorts of discrimination, but particularly disability. And the stats, I've been reading stats for years in employment work and policy work we used to do in the centres about people with disability statistically are more loyal employees than people without disability. They get a job and they stick to it, and their heart, that's what the stats show, and they've shown that for years. I know, part of what I've told you on the Disability Royal Commission, and I know recently they had an employment one. Might be worth people having a look at that, where Graham Innes, former Australian Human Rights Commissioner, spoke, and I think they're going to do another one next year on the topic of employment. It was only a couple of weeks ago. It was before the public hearing I was involved in, and Graham he gave evidence and talked about the stats, those sorts of stats, again, more up-to-date ones, but that might be interesting for people who are interested. And really, it's something, if people aren't aware, people with dyslexia aren't aware, it's about them as well. It's about violence, neglect, exploitation, etc. But it covers it's wide ranging. It's covering whole areas. The Disability Royal Commission website's pretty accessible, and you can access all of the transcripts, audios, all that sort of stuff. It's totally accessible. So if people are interested in looking at that, and it'd be a public hearing on employment in December or November, maybe late November this year.
So it just happened.
21, yeah, it just
21.
happened.
Okay.
I heard in the media. I was too busy preparing for my own, and I think it was only a very short one, a day or two, and so I think there might be a follow-up one next year on the topic of employment for people with disability. That
would be good to watch that space and to learn more about. With your experience, are there some key things that employers could be doing? I mean, you just touched on empathy and walk in my shoes. Is there anything practically that you think employers could be doing to better support their employees with disabilities, whether it's dyslexia or just in general?
It's hard to say. I mean, you would have thought, with COVID and the effects on, the employment market and the really volatile employment market we have, and I know it affects different areas, obviously not suggesting people all become fruit pickers because we can't get, Polynesian people and Kiwis to come over and pick all the fruit. But, I would have thought at the moment in a lot of industries, and I see it even if I go past cafes or restaurants, and I know they're struggling with it, we're going to close down again. But I would have thought now is a time where employers are really looking for employees and ought to be a bit more broad-minded about who they take on, and if people are keen and willing to work and they have to make a few adjustments, that they would want to take them on. And if they find them loyal and willing to do all sorts of shifts and being flexible if things change, that really there's a bit of a shift in favour of employees. But I don't know about that. Some of the bigger organisations, and this is what Graham Innes I know he talks about this and talked about this in his evidence at the Royal Commission recently, the bigger private employers like the Woolworths and Coles, and then obviously Commonwealth and state governments having to meet quota and percentage of employing people with disability, and they really should be pulling their fingers out and doing that. He has ideas around how governments and contractors should view big organisations to do a due diligence and check and say, all right, well, how many of your employers at Coles have a disability, even on diversity and other things. But so there are ways that business and government can drive that change better, I think, by kind of demanding that, if you want a government contract, then we want to know A, B, and C about your workforce. Without that kind of top level driving, then it's really that's sort of changing attitudes by the bottom dollar. And as I said, you can't change attitudes usually overnight, but the bottom dollar, the bottom line, I should say, might change things a bit more. It's really hard to say. I guess my mind's swimming through all different sorts of jobs, and from a carpenter to a lawyer to there's all sorts of different things they can do. It's really just value, seeing a new employee and the value they bring to you, and whether there are different aspects of them that are strong. It's like all of us. I'm not strong in certain parts of being a barrister, and in other parts I'm stronger. Same with all employees. It's having a mindset where you focus on what's the value this person brings to me. Well, they're loyal, they've never turned up late, they're really keen to learn. What do I have to do? Well, I just have to do a toolbox talk in the morning rather than just send the email the night before and just go through the bullet points. And I have to have my phone on me if they need to be reminded or ring me. I'm just thinking about dyslexia as a point, that I'm there and I can just speak to them. I think technology is incredible, and I have friends who are blind, and so one is a partner in the big law firm that I worked pro bono in. Darren's incredible, and technology has changed and enabled him to do that role like nothing before. So technology for dyslexia and all the voice apps and all that stuff we've got now, I think, has to really be not only assisting the person to access that and break down barriers around them in their environment, but employers too can use that kind of technology as an adjustment to meet the inherent requirements. There's so much more, drag and speak, all this stuff you can use. I think of an example of, and I can't remember the name of it, but I know there's a second series coming up this year. You probably know about it. It's the ABC with Jay on it. The ABC documentary
Lost
recently.
for Words.
Lost for Words, and my wife and I watched that. We loved it, and I can't think of his name, but the Pommy guy, how he was. I mean, it was painstaking, but I thought that's really clever. Is that he'll read into it or take a photo, or that just the ingenuity for him to. Okay, it took him a lot longer than it would take me to go around, but he was still capable of doing it because of technology. And I thought, wow,
Yeah, and I felt really sad when they took it away from him.
Yeah,
because I was like, no, but that's not fair, because that's how he would manage like day to day. I now am becoming more and more reliant on Siri, because it helps me significantly, and I wouldn't have been able to travel or drive a car without technology, because I would get so lost. I'd have to call my sister, and she'd have to look up in the Melways. That's how old I am now, for people who don't know what a Melways is. It's a book that has maps in it, and she would have to try and find where I was in the Melways, and then try and help me get out of where I was, because I would get so lost. So technology has enabled me to travel the world on my own, to do so many things. And for employers that are listening, or managers out there, you can also access government funding to help fund some of this assistive technology. And some of it is free, some of it's at such a low cost as well. There's a variety of different things that we can use now to help in the workplace. But yes, technology is key, I think, in enabling us to work. Though I still need a human being to read my work. Technology hasn't quite got to that level yet for me. If we're looking from the person with the disabilities perspective, are there some key points you could summarise for our listeners before you said, mediation and trying to raise the issue with your employer or your institution first? But are there some key steps that you could just summarise for our listeners?
Key steps the whole way through, or
after? Probably. Yeah. If you've tried to work it out, and when people call us and they are feeling distressed about the workplace, usually it's first, have you disclosed, and two, do you have an HR department that you could talk to? And then sometimes people come back to us and they work through how they're going to disclose, and we don't say you should or you shouldn't. It's a very personal choice, but we give them tools and resources if they want to disclose. And some the feedback we've had from people who have done that has been really positive.
That's good.
In most of my jobs, it's never been positive. But if people have disclosed and they've gone through those steps, is it coming to someone like us and then we try and help them find a lawyer? Do you think that's the best step after they've tried to mediate and that hasn't worked?
I think it probably is, or one of the legal services, to see whether they can at least get some advice around, strengths of taking it as a formal complaint in New South Wales to the Anti-Discrimination Board, or also in New South Wales but across Australia, the Australian Human Rights Commission under the Disability Discrimination Act. One thing I would say, just stepping back, is, and you probably encourage them to do this, but they should always, and whether it's, I guess it might be audio, they should record events as they happen as best they can. So keep a record, contemporaneous record of what's happening. Today I asked Bob if he could, do X, which is an adjustment, and he said, "Oh no, it'll take too long." The best you can, just because for lawyers later on, understanding the intricacies of what's happened, you'd be surprised how sometimes little things can, really assist in understanding the complexities of a complaint. So keep every bit of correspondence, any document, but also do an oral audio record of the significant events, or encourage, if they ring you and say all these things have happened, say, okay, well, slow down, let's work through it, and after this, can you go away and can you do just like a diary, like a log of what's happened over the last week, or even what you remember, even if you can't remember exactly every time and date or who said what, and then you've time stamped it, and it might be useful. You can courts can have those as exhibits if you need be. It doesn't have to be written. It can be transcribed after, if it needs to be in a document for a court. So that's really important, just keeping a record of what's been happening for posterity. So, you can't resolve it. I mean, sometimes you get people who are at the point where they're being threatened that they've got to resign or be stood down. That's obviously a really difficult time, and a time where they really do need a lawyer. The other area I should say, so I don't miss it, is you can bring the Fair Work Commission under the Fair Work Act. There's a section 351 which prohibits you being discriminated against for race, disability, So I should also make sure that people are aware they have rights under the Fair Work Act not to be discriminated against. And the beauty of that is that there's also the Fair Work Commission has a, it starts out as a document that's pretty accessible, just like the ADB and just like Australian Human Rights Commission. They're user-friendly. You don't need a lawyer. It doesn't hurt to have a lawyer at the time, but you can, if you're dismissed or terminated, you can, the reason is you just think it's so harsh and unfair, and it's really because of your dyslexia, and you've asked for an adjustment that you don't think is unreasonable or what have you, or even if you do, or you think I'm not sure, that's another port of call they should bear in mind if it's employment, particularly if they've just been sacked or they've resigned, where they're saying, well, I had no choice but to resign. It was just I couldn't stay there. Then they need to also, not only if they can't get advice from a disability discrimination lawyer, their union may be more, if they're in a union, or another lawyer might be able to assist them who does employment industrial law. I should make that very clear. because there is that section under the Fair Work Act that brings in protections. And in some cases, it can actually be a better, stronger, applicant-friendly type of case to bring than disability discrimination. There's a couple of tricks in there that put the onus back on the employer to show why they dismissed someone or why they terminated them or why they treated them adversely, that it wasn't because of their disability. So, yeah, much can be, and I do that work as well, as do a lot of my colleagues in these chambers. So that's an employment sphere. Don't forget there's a protection there. But finding someone to give you some legal advice to really ensure that the complaint or the Fair Work Commission form that you're filing has all the right bits in it, that I guess would be useful, or a union person who's familiar with them to say, make sure you've got this, this, and this. But if you don't have any of that, that's where I think if you've kept a record, you've got the ins and outs of what's happened. That's the most important thing to include in the complaint. Have the key parts in there, and look, as I said earlier, the Anti-Discrimination Board and the Australian Human Rights Commission and the Fair Work Commission receive the forms or complaints. They look at them, they triage them, they'll assist a person to ensure they've got all the right material in their form. They're not advising them, they're just saying, look, this part of your form, you haven't filled this out. Do you want to go away and think about it? So in some ways you get that informal assistance to make sure you get it right enough to get to a conciliation in those forums. So you get some of the way there. Sure, having a good, knowledgeable, reasonable lawyer at a conciliation against an employer where there is obviously a power imbalance inherently, yes, that would be wonderful if every single person could get that, but that's not reality, and that doesn't happen. But again, going back to some of those places like legal aid or barristers or others that might do that work, particularly if there's systemic value to it, there might be something they can take on and assist. Then very quickly, and you might be about to ask me that, if you don't resolve a matter at the Fair Work Commission, at the sort of conciliation mediation phase, or at the ADB or the equivalents across Australia, or the Australian Human Rights Commission, then each of those places essentially terminates the complaint, and then you have a right, you don't have to, but you have a right to bring it to a tribunal or a court, and then you really do, you want at that point, if you're thinking of that, to get some legal advice, because if you go through the ADB, you go into a tribunal in New South Wales, and it's the same across Australia, like Victoria has VCAT. The Fair Work Commission, because you brought it under the Fair Work Division, if you go up into a federal court, what's called the Federal Circuit Court, similarly with the Australian Human Rights Commission, if you go to court, you go to a federal court. Now, it all sounds big and scary, etc. The beauty of the tribunal and the beauty of Fair Work is that it's a no-cost jurisdiction. So if you go up into the tribunal and the court, if you lose, unless you do something ridiculous or outrageous, or you get an offer that's too good to refuse and you refuse it, even if you lose, you don't have to pay the other side's costs. So that's a real benefit. I mean, you still want a lawyer, I suppose, to assist you, but in terms of if I go in here and, if I lose, do I pay $1 million because that's what my employer paid their lawyers? No. Australian Human Rights Commission disability discrimination claims that go to the federal court are a cost jurisdiction. So, if you run those and lose, you're at risk of paying not only whatever you pay for your lawyers, if they're charging you, but the lawyers for your former employer. Tactically, there can be advantages, though, to it being a cost jurisdiction. So I've got to say most of the matters I run are through the Australian Human Rights Commission, or that I recommend, and then we go off to the federal court because there's a bigger stick to wave, because they're matters where I've said you've got reasonable or better prospects of success. A stick to wave at the other side is that they're going to have to pay your bill. I think you've got a strong case. So that sort of swings and roundabouts. It can work in your favour. But if you were going in there and you didn't have a lot of advice, but you felt strongly you wanted to take it on, the tribunal or the Fair Work Commission are probably the better places to go, because you're not running the risk that you're going to get hammered with costs of the other side at the end of it.
And so what if it's an institution that you're wanting to take for discrimination? Would you go through the Human Rights Commission and then up to the federal court if need be?
What do you mean by an institution?
Or an organisation. So say we've had some people contact us wanting help because they earlier said they've finished their degree but they can't pass the registration assessments and they haven't been given the reasonable adjustments needed for their disability.
You can take that either through your state or territory anti-discrimination board or the Australian Human Rights Commission. I think, because under the area of activity is likely to be education, or would be education, and those are areas protected by both the state and territory anti-discrimination legislation and the Disability Discrimination Act. So you've got a choice. Can I tell people Sklavos, if you haven't heard of Sklavos, SKLAVOS, against, I think, Dermatological Society or something, is this exact case you're talking about, which is a fellow, and I can't remember his disability, but he asked for adjustments to do the practical course. He goes down in a screaming heap because it's about, essentially, they say, well, you're trying to adjust a course in such a way that it's a bit of like an inherent requirements or an academic integrity of the course. What you're asking for just means it's not the course and you couldn't be accredited to do it. So it's that fine line between, is the adjustment just kind of, not so inherent or so profound it's changing it, or if it is, then they got up on a justifiable hardship and an inherent requirements basis. So it's one to read. It's only a couple of years ago. I think it's definitely in the time where, since 2009, we've had the reasonable adjustments under the DDA. It's definitely one in that realm where he argued that they failed to make a reasonable adjustment, and it was adjustments to that, how he was assessed in that course. So Sklavos is one to read, to teach you, and they're often, sadly for the applicant, they lose, but they can help teach others by reverse about what not to do. I mean, there's a number of education cases in Victoria, more for younger people with disability and autism and developmental disabilities and things, really tricky cases where the families and the parents and the student lost, and they went off to the federal court and things, and against Education Victoria or State of Victoria. So there's a lot to be learned about what not to do, sadly, from those cases, and Sklavos is probably the example for specific to colleges, registration, that sort of thing. And there's another one, University of Newcastle, my hometown, Newcastle, which is a converse where they prevailed. I'll email it to you. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was one brought, unlike Sklavos, who went Australian Human Rights Commission Federal Court or Federal Circuit Court. This one was run through the Anti-Discrimination Board, didn't resolve, and then that went to what's called here the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. And from memory, it was about a person with a disability that I think was a woman, and it was medicine. I think she had a psychosocial disability, and it was about, they refused to grant her an extension, whether it was practical, it might have been, you've got to do it within X period of time after your final exams, and she had, as happens with that disability from time to time, periodic ups and downs. And they refused her to do it, and she might have had failed a couple of subjects as well, which meant it took 9 years to do a course that normally you do four. She prevailed. It's a really good case to read. So it's a flip side of Sklavos, not quite there, but an interesting example around that kind of tertiary qualifications finishing. Institution says no. Tribunal says, well, you said no on the basis, and was on the basis of disability, but your defence of unjustifiable hardship doesn't stack up, or what they were asking for was not unreasonable. So I'll send that to you. I'm sorry I don't have the name off the top of my head.
No, that's okay.
Newcastle University. It might be 6 or 7 years old now, and it would be an NCAT, I think, if people wanted to look for it. But I'll send it to you.
That'd be great. Thank you. And both really interesting cases to learn more about, because the more we advocate, the more people coming to us for help. And like I said, we are not in the legal realm at all. But if there's information that we can provide to help people think things through, that's really valuable. And I think this podcast will be extremely valuable to our listeners as well.
And even if you read those cases, and sure, there's all the sections and the acts and this and that, but even just reading they set out the facts, and even I think even reading through it, even if you don't know the law inside out, you get a fairly good handle, especially when you've probably got a similar lived experience to go, oh yeah, or yes, this is similar to mine, or it's different, just to get a feel. I don't suggest you can suddenly go off and run a case, but it's worth if it's there, just having a read and thinking about it.
And for those of you listening, if it goes up on our website, then you can listen to it, so you don't have to read it as well. So we'll make it more accessible for you.
Yeah, I'm saying read in the same way I say to my blind friend Darren, can you read this, mate? Well, good to see
you. We're very literal. Right. I'm very literal. No, there's quite a few of us that are very literal. So just so that people know that we're not just talking about reading, you can listen to it. No. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today? This has been really informative. Thank you. And again, people can go and listen and watch your presentation. Yeah, it's given me a lot to think about, that's for sure, when we have these calls.
I guess lawyers need to be careful that they are always aware that it's easy to talk about these things and running off to court. And, I also realise the toll these things can take on individuals who aren't familiar with the system. And, a barrister is meant to be dispassionate about their case. And whereas for the client, it's all about, a lot of it, it's hard to divorce the emotions and the feelings, etc., from a lawyer who's saying to you, well, this is the offer and this is actually a good one. It's like, really? Is this a good one? So, yeah, there's the law and there's reality and there's lawyers who haven't gone through the experience. So, yeah, just bearing that in mind for people that come along and might speak to a lawyer and think, well, they don't really – I mean, hopefully they get it, but sometimes a really hard decision for a lawyer is to say, and I often say, look, I'm taking a hat off. This is my human hat. If someone had treated me like that, I'd be really pissed off, excuse my French, and I would really be angry. But I'll put my lawyer's hat on, and these are the difficulties and the stress of running a case, and you'll be in it. If we go off to the tribunal or the court, you'll be in a witness box and you'll be cross-examined by someone ugly like me who's suggesting that you're the one who's got it all wrong. So, yeah, just to bear all that in mind. Having said that, the stats are pretty good. 80-90% of matters conciliate. Really high proportion. They don't run off to court. So people shouldn't also listen to that and say, I won't go off and file a complaint, because a lot of them do resolve. It's, the employer's got to spend money on lawyers to go off to a court they don't want to do. If they can, it might be, all right, well, I acknowledge I did the wrong thing. Sure, I stuffed up. I've now sat in a room and listened to my ex-employer. I now actually better understand it. I will give you an apology, and I'll tide you over X amount of money. So, and I'll undertake to do some training, and some amazing things can happen in conciliation. I've been really moved in them, and I think they're really important. So I won't undersell the ability to get in there and actually get someone to listen to you. And it can be cathartic for a person, even if they don't get the result that they wanted to get during the conciliation. I've had education matters, parents and employment matters, and just the catharsis and the letting go. I'm like, finally, I thank you so much for being here with me. I don't care that they're not giving me $5,000 or their apology is not really that strong. The fact I've stood up for myself, the fact that they might think twice next time if someone like me comes along is all, So there's a lot of power and empowerment in conciliations and making complaints. So I'd encourage people to do so and not to balk at it if they're unfamiliar with it.
And my final question, now that you've just said that, before we go, is, do you find that most times after conciliation that, like, everyone at the end of the day wants to do the right thing? Do you find that it really is generally through ignorance and lack of awareness and understanding that these events occur rather than anything untoward?
Sinister. Yeah, I do. I do think that. It's also humans, you see it a lot in education matters. I said it earlier, where principal and a parent just can no longer communicate because each of them thinks they're doing the right thing. And that can often happen, particular education. It's, this is what we say, this is what our specialist says. We don't have extra people in the classroom, and there's a whole host of things going on. There's teachers not wanting, so there's so much going on, but one person may not be able to see what the other person's seeing. And then they go down a road. It's almost like the parallel lines suddenly diverge and they go off and they're never going to come back together. And so there needs to be a circuit breaker or a person in the middle who can build the bridge again. So same with employers. They can form an impression about someone, or I don't know, all the other stresses going on in their business, and they can lose sight of the fact they can't see through the eyes of the person who's in front of them. I think that's what it comes down to, in these matters. And so that's why conciliation, if people can go in there, and they might go in there a bit kind of annoyed or whatever, or thinking, I'm just turning up. But I have seen powerful moments where I've seen both sides. I've seen people shake hands, or the days we could hug people, hug people and say, thanks so much. I'm sorry it didn't work out, but thanks for coming today, and I really feel like it's resolved. It's been very rare occasion in almost 20 years of doing conciliations where it's rare that I've walked out with a client who said, that was the worst thing I've ever done. I don't think anyone's ever said it's the worst thing I've ever done. It's really powerful.
Well, thank you. And I think that they're really positive words used around empowerment and, getting the opportunity to stand up for ourselves, because I think sometimes with a hidden disability, so often we don't have the strength or the courage. And I can give you many examples where I've been in those situations. And the energy, sometimes it's just easier to walk away than to stand up. So thank you. I hope that this podcast has empowered people and has given them information that they may need, and they can follow up with us if they have any further questions. And we'll put all that information on the website as well. So thank you so much for your time.
No worries.
To find out more about Ben and his work, including the articles he discussed today, head to deardyslexic.com. And if you haven't done so yet, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we're doing, including our advocacy and awareness work, peer support programs, research, and the D-Hub, our digital learning platform for all your needs. If you love this podcast, well, why not sponsor one today? To find out more, head to deardyslexic.com.